Good evening, welcome. It's now 6 o'clock. I'm handing over to Dr. Nyati. Thank you, Dr. Nyati.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. It is really good to have you here. Happy 1st of August. I don't know whether 1st of August is Spring Day because people were sending me pictures of flowers in Cape Town. The birds are back. And so I'm not sure whether we're still in winter or not, but it is really great to have you here today. Hopefully you're warm where you are. Sama has decided to take it upon themselves to invite us to a series of hard conversations. Last week, or at least a few weeks ago, they had a hard conversation about gender-based violence in the workplace. Today, we're having another tough conversation about academic bullying and harassment in the medical profession and medical schools. Now, I can imagine on hearing this topic that some of you may immediately have strong emotions that are aroused. And I can imagine that some of you may have very vivid and strong memories that relate to this topic. And as we're having this conversation, I'd like to invite you to remember to breathe. Remember your breath, remember to calm yourselves if you find yourself in really difficult situation as it relates to this conversation. So it's good that I remind you this. It's one of those, remember when an episode starts that says, this episode may rouse strong emotion for sensitive viewers. It's one of those. Remember to breathe throughout the session. Today, the conversation that I'm facilitating is going to be led initially by a presentation by Dr. Luc Lamprecht. He says that Afrikaans is like a throat disease. Those are his words, not mine. And he's going to take us through his presentation on this topic. Now, what I like about the framing of the invitation was that academic bullying is a range of behaviors ranging from verbal abuse through all the way intimidation and professional sabotage. And the framing of a range of behaviors is a very important one because it enables us to have the conversation in multiple ways. Luke is known as a connector of conversations. He has is working on his MEC on neurodevelopment studies and has facilitated many conversations and webinars on the topic of bullying. And so he's a great person to assist us in this conversation. The aim of today is to do three things. The one is to bubble to the surface this very conversation. Some of these conversations are swept under the carpet. We're not doing that today. I guess since you are all medical professionals, you'll understand the concept of lancing a boil. This is what we're going to do today. And then through the conversation, we will see if we can have some handles and language that can help us navigate this topic. And then the last thing that we're hoping to do today is to start with beginnings of some contemplations on how change could look like. We cannot boil this ocean today. And so this is why I'm just boxing it for you so that at least you know what we're going to do today. Luke, I would like to invite you to switch on your camera, please, and your mic, and get ready to do your presentation. While you put your slide up, I'd like to welcome all of you to please put your questions in the Q&A box there at the bottom of your screens. If you will share your thoughts, share some of your comments, it would be really great to have them there. I will take as many of them as I can, and I'll try to group them as we go. Please do not wait until the conversation is over before you start adding your questions and answers. If you can keep running commentary going, I'd be most grateful. Over to you, Luke.
Right. Good evening, folks. Can I be heard and is my presentation visible?
Yes, sir.
Fantastic. All right, so I've headed the brief SAMA and professionalism in health leadership, and that's really the context that I would like to create. I mean, it's really about the fact that we are trying to lead young people who are joining the profession, the caring professions, into being caring people. And for me, the starting point is really about boundaries. And you'll see as the presentation goes on that the boundaries is really the frame in which I position my work. So who am I? I grew up in the south of Joburg. I'm known primarily for my child protection work. That's sort of within the sort of medical fraternity. I'm an MSc in child health, particularly neurodevelopment and pathology. So just to say, I'm a student and I lecture, so I sort of live in various elements of the sort of academic and medical world. I run a boxing gym in Hillbrow. I'm a fitness instructor, a chef, a musician, and I'm proud of my city. So this is the context in which I work. So the context is an important thing because there's a whole lot of dynamics that come with the context in which I work, which has informed a lot of my thinking. And I think the young people that I work with have potentially taught me more than I've taught them. So when we look at the context of leadership in general, but particularly within the medical fraternity, there are a variety of leadership styles. And there is an autocratic leadership style, which at times is like a military leadership style, and it is entirely appropriate in certain contexts. For example, in the military, if you are leading a group of soldiers into battle, or you in the trenches in the First World War, and you put your head up and someone's shooting at you, you're not going to have a meeting to reach a consensus about ducking. You are going to have a leader who says duck because they are the people who know, and everybody uniformly ducks because there is a value in that kind of leadership. And within the medical fraternity, there's a real need for that kind of leadership. For example, particularly in emergency medicine, and there are people who need to lead. There are people who need to listen. It's not about having a conversation or a debate. It's about the fact that there are lives at stake. And there is a hierarchy, and that hierarchy involves staff, so people who you employ, and it involves colleagues, and at times it involves you being staff. So there's a context in which autocratic leadership is entirely appropriate and needs to be used because it is the correct form of leadership for the correct context. Then generally, most of us who get into these kind of caring professions, if you ask us why we did it, we will have some kind of messianic answer to it, where we will say, we wanted to make a difference, we wanted to save lives, we wanted to create meaning in our own lives. And the interesting thing about the servitude leadership element, particularly within the medical world and medical training, is the fact that there is this idea of service, that what we do is we serve people, and that sometimes that servitude kind of leadership and the servitude way of being in the world is at cost to you. So, I mean, if you think of any kind of training, an emergency training or medical training, extremely long hours, relatively poor self-care, this huge, which I'll get into a little bit later, this huge kind of rite of passage in order to enter into what are the hallowed halls of medicine, and correctly so, because it's an enormously important job that you do, and people's lives and well-being are at stake. But there is at times a cost. Well, there certainly is a cost to self, and at times a cost to one's own family, so one support structures. And then there's the one that I'm trying to sort of implement at the moment in my context, and that's kind of a transformational kind of leadership. So it's the idea of me being the kind of person that someone wants to follow. So discipline meaning to teach, and disciple meaning following. And it's really about mentoring, teaching, and training, because I'm aging, I'm in my mid-50s, and there's not a lot of people who want to do the work that I do in terms of sort of this hardcore child protection stuff. So the idea for me is about, creating a world where we create sort of the wow of the world, where young people want to follow in my footsteps and want to be in the profession because I'm the front face of it. But all of these styles shift based on the context and the shifting nature of relationships, and obviously the individual and their particular temperament, their particular communication style. And that sort of, there's a huge set of intersections that happen there. So there's age intersections, there's race intersections, there's all kinds of linguistic issues, there's gender intersections. So there's a very complex Venn diagram where we have multiple things laid over multiple things. And sometimes it's quite difficult to transition between those different kinds of styles, between being the person who heads a trauma unit to being someone who is, there in service of others, to being someone who lectures and teaches. So it's sometimes very hard to shift between those, and that is often just based on personality and based on the kind of temperament that we have and how we are in the world in general. So some of these skills, as we shift, need to be learned. So the big message for me in pretty much all I've done in kind of the work I do in, for example, elite boys boarding schools, or in Sangoma training centers in Alex, is that tradition doesn't need to be traumatic. So the big thing is that there are these rites of passage. There are certain things that need to be done in order for you to enter the profession, and many of those are absolutely necessary, are wonderful, and should actually be celebrated. However, there is a strange kind of underbelly to, frankly, the whole kind of system, not just medicine, is that there's this secrecy element that is built in. There's this group of us who know certain things that other people don't know, and as a result, we are an elite group, and that elite group has a set of secrets. Now, I'm not necessarily talking about secrets in the sense of good and bad secrets. It's we know things other people don't know. But the problem is what happens is that the power of any kind of abuse is the secret. And that's really what we are trying to undo. So an example would be, which I'm sure most of you, have been exposed to in terms of media coverage, is that Wilgenhof men's residence at Stellenbosch University. And this whole idea that in order for you to enter a certain place, there's a particular rite of passage. So we can think of rites of passage from, for example, if you from a Christian community, you would have a baptism. If you are Jewish, you would have a bris, you would have a bar mitzvah. If you're a Xhosa man, you would go to the mountain. So there's this idea that there are these liminal spaces where we move in our potential selves from one place to another. And we talk about these rites of passage as the hero's journey, where you go from this place of being kind of safe and cocoon, for example, at home. You move from there, say, into high school in a boys' hostel. You then meet your mentor. And then what happens is there is this ordeal that happens. And it's that ordeal which, if done correctly, releases the correct set of hormones, which then create a level of connection, a feeling of belonging, and you then move into an identity as, for example, a neurosurgeon or whatever. And that whole journey and that ordeal that needs to be gone through is a necessary part of the journey. However, that ordeal is where some of the problems occur and cause problems later down the line. So it's a slippery slope. And this slippery slope sort of starts with the types of relationships that we have. So types of relationships I'm referring to are do we know each other before we come into academia? So in other words, were we at school together or were we friends? Did we study together and now one has gone in this direction and another in that direction? We were once friends, but now I'm your boss. I'm still your friend, but I'm also your boss, and decided to specialize. You didn't. And there's this whole shifting of the types of relationships and this kind of Venn diagram of a whole lot of relationships that overlap with one another, and being able to shift roles between those is actually very, very complex. So I'll give you an example from my work. So as I say, I work in the inner city of Joburg, and I in fact work at the old children's hospital in the inner city, where I was a patient 52 years ago and have been in that building for the last 32 years. So I've seen the world change around me a lot. And we get young people from the city who come in and they want to learn, for example, to be fitness instructors or coaches or life coaches or whatever. And they start with me when they are 10, 11 years old, and now they're 22. They went from being a beneficiary of my program to now being a staff member. It's a difficult transition for me because I have these young people who have grown up literally with me, and now what they are is they are my staff. And that relationship changes, and it's a difficult shift to make. And I have to remind myself, hang on, this is not someone who is a beneficiary of my program. This is a person who is now developing their own set of skills, their CV, they're finding their way in the world, and how do I facilitate that? Equally for them, it's complicated because they come from an environment that is very close in geography. So the inner city bowl is actually a very small area. And a lot of the young people come from the same area. So they will come into the gym where they're friends because they're friends at school, or they're neighbors because it's a word of mouth thing. And they will come into the gym, and then one will excel and he will be promoted to a staff member, and that transition from from a beneficiary to a staff member, his friends are now beneficiaries and he's staff. How do we help him transition or her transition those spaces? And it's been really difficult. And an example that is an extreme example of that, which I will get to in the criminality part, is the Parktown Boys High School case, which I'm sure many of you have heard about. It's a case that I gave evidence in. And what was interesting about that case was that the young man, and he was young, he was 22, when he was arrested and charged, there were 23 complainants, about 400 charges. And when they were cross-examining me, they said to me at the end of the cross-examination, they said, you know, Mr. Lomprecht, you didn't interview my client. I said, no, I didn't. You didn't ask me to. They then said, well, you know, if you had, they would have said this is what happened to them. And this was the way of the school. And I said, okay, then please ask him to tell us who did it to him, and I will get them as well. Because in my opinion, the day you choose to victimize, you lose your right to your own victimhood. So there's a very complex context around that, because they just simply moved him from being a matric boy who was a very good sportsman into roles of housemaster, head of prep, water polo coach, etc., and they didn't transition him, and I think they didn't transition the staff either. So he was caught in this weird kind of place in between. Is he a peer? Is he a staff member? Is he a colleague? Because he's not quite a colleague, because he's still being treated like a learner. So it was a very, very complex blurring. But then what happened is this kind of slide occurs. And when the roles shift from being, for example, studying medicine to being a registrar to being a specialist to super specializing, etc., what happens is the where we are positioned in terms of each other change. So, I mean, many of my students academically have surpassed me in unbelievable ways, because I'm not a natural academic. I'm not a great researcher. In fact, I'm actually very bad at research, in fact, and I need help. And the people who were my students are now teaching me how to do good research, because I'm just really bad at it. And I'm not quite sure why, but I'm just bad at it. So that shift in roles is about the fact that people go in different directions, and how do we manage that shift? Then what happens is that if that shift in role is a struggle, what we want to do is we first want to start by being proactive. So if we see things slipping, we want to say, hang on, I'm not sure how to do this. And that doesn't mean that, that we're stupid or something. It's just something we've never done. I don't know how to do this. We want the people who are in those change roles to be able to say, hang on, I'm not sure that's appropriate in the current context. And we want to be able to have these kind of courageous conversations to say, hang on, how do we realign this system? I mean, we do it in our homes when our children become teenagers and we suddenly have a stranger in our house. We do it as when we adults, when our children leave home. We do it when we are dating, and then we're engaged, and then we're married, and then we become parents. So there's a constant shift, and it's about communicating that not in a confrontational way, and in the workplace, in the academic place, being able to do it in a way that is related to performance enhancement. We want to do our jobs better. We don't want to be bad at what we do, and I don't think any of us want to be bad at what we do. When that fails, however, we end up in the realm which we don't want to end up in, which is the realm of the law. So the first element of the law is, obviously disciplinaries. So you have done something that is against your employment conditions, against your code of conduct, and you are brought before some kind of disciplinary committee, and there's someone who's presenting evidence and someone has to defend themselves, and it's unpleasant because it's adversarial by nature, sometimes necessary, but really not the first choice. And then there is the parallel stream of registrations, by which I'm referring to the HPCSA, and the ability of the registering body to hold people accountable in terms of their professionalism. So that those two things overlap and sometimes run in parallel to one another. And these dual academic and clinical quite complicated, because you're lecturing and you're part of, say, VIT, but at the same time you're working on the pediatric circuit and you're lecturing, but you're also working, and there's differing roles, and who's the head of pediatrics and who's the head of academics, and etc. So it becomes quite difficult, but those boundaries are put in place to say these are the bounds within which your profession operates. And if you want to be professional, it's in terms of your entire employment. So in other words, in terms of the people who employ you, as well as how you treat the people you employ. It's in terms of the registration and how do you manage those dual roles. Then we get into two that I'm going to go into a little bit of detail with, because interestingly, this presentation, when Salma asked me to do it, is new territory for me, because I'm a child person. I'm not an adult person. But what has happened is there's been some shifts in the law that have been really interesting and have kind of extended my mandate to some extent in terms of age, which I'll explain as we go along. So the first thing that has been put in place in terms of the law where the above don't work, so in other words, the HR and HPCSA systems don't work, is, and this is obviously in relation to both patients and colleagues and students and so on. So it's the harassment legislation. Now, the harassment legislation was put in place specifically to fill a gap in domestic violence situation. So domestic violence is what it says it is. It's in domestic situations. It's people who live together. Whereas the harassment legislation was there to deal with people harassing other people who don't live together necessarily, but there are certain kinds of behaviors. And interestingly, what the harassment legislation does is it provides almost like a big stick. So it provides a mechanism by which you can, say to people, listen, don't behave like this. Otherwise, there'll be consequences. And that is the sort of the place in between kind of employment and registration and criminality. And then obviously there's criminality, which I'll get to. But the reason for the extension of kind of my mandate has actually been the extension of the definition of vulnerable persons, which I'll deal with in the next 2 slides. So the Protection from Harassment Act basically says that harassment is any unwanted contact. So in other words, it's not something consented to, and consent is obviously something that is vocalized. It's something that is asked and is received. But for me, it's kind of the way they phrase it for me is really the cornerstone of everything that I try and do, because it's conduct that violates a person's dignity. Now, if we look at the rights of all people, the right to dignity is at the base of everything. We all want to be treated in dignified ways. And in my opinion, because of who I want to be in the world, I want to behave in a dignified way. But anyway, this unwanted, unconsented conduct violates dignity and creates an intimidating, hostile, degrading, coercive, humiliating, offensive environment. So it's lots of stuff. So it can be threats of being excluded. It can be promises of promotion. It can be looking at people with a certain lens without recognizing that it's about the fact that there are unhappinesses about policies, and as a result there's kind of this almost go slow passive aggressive kind of stuff. So it's a whole lot of stuff, but very importantly, it can include direct or indirect behaviors. Now, if you go and you look at, for example, which I'm not sure many of you have, but if you go and look at what happened in the St. Andrews case, where we had, the grooming and then the unfortunate suicide of that young man, there's direct and indirect behavior, and there's acts of commission and acts of omission. So a direct behavior is obviously, well, it's direct. It's you and the other person. Indirect behavior is, for example, reporting someone to HR or giving them a low score on a performance appraisal, or it's stuff that's not directed at them, but it's kind of there in the background. And it leads to harm or creates a reasonable belief of potential harm. And that's the important part. And harm can mean anything. It can mean emotional harm, physical harm, sexual harm. It can mean harm to your career, harm to your promotion, harm to your mental health. There's a whole range of potential harms that can be created. And the acts of commission are things that are done. In other words, you do things to people. Acts of omission are things not done. So what was very interesting in the St. Andrews case was that the principal lost his job because of an act of omission. So in other words, he could not possibly believe that this person he had employed is such a wonderful person, could possibly groom young boys. And as a result, he just simply didn't believe the young boy, which, basically means he said the young boy was lying. And as a result, he did nothing. So because he did nothing, he lost his job. So it's not just about acts of commission where harm is caused. It's people in positions of leadership who do not actively protect. So in terms of the rights of persons and dignity, the first duty we have is a negative duty, do no harm. And then there's a positive duty, which is to actively protect. Okay. Sorry, I thought I heard someone speaking. Okay. Then we have protection orders. And that's exactly what I'm referring to. A protection order is an order of court that prohibits the harasser from continuing the harmful or unwanted behavior. And you can get a court order for it. And what is it?
So I've got my password ready to go.
And there is feedback. Somebody's mic is on. Not sure.
Sorry, that was Diane, but she's muted now.
Thank you.
Okay, so the protection order is an order that prohibits certain behavior. Now, what I find so interesting about protection orders is the court has to tell you to not swear at people, violate their rights, say sexual things to them, make innuendos. I mean, I don't know why the court has to tell people to do, to do things and not do things that in any way you shouldn't be doing. But it does allow for a court order. What is interesting about that court order is it's not criminal in nature, but what it does do is it creates the potential for a criminal offense. So in other words, if you violate that order, it is a criminal offense, which means that you can be, will be imprisoned, fined, and potentially kind of end up on various kinds of registers and things. Then you have an extension, which I found very interesting, and it's a very recent extension. It was a 2022 extension in the amendments, where those of you who work with children and persons with disabilities, you'll know that the Sexual Offences Act says that anybody who has knowledge or reasonable belief or suspicion that a sexual offence has been committed against a child, a person with a disability. But what they've added is a person who is vulnerable, and which I'm going to get to, they must report it to the police because a crime arises from it, whether that be non-contact sexual abuse, for example, sending messages on phones, saying things, insinuating things, grooming, etc., to acts of obviously commission, things where, sexual assault, etc. And if you don't do it, you can be held criminally accountable. So that's an offense. And again, there's a fine. My wife would have had a heart attack because she's an English teacher and I've made a big typo there. I don't know what my computer did. Anyway, that's supposed to say fine or imprisonment for a period not exceeding 5 years or both. So what is interesting for this conversation around, medical school teaching, etc., is that there are many other categories of vulnerable people, by the way, but I've just taken out the ones that are relevant to tonight's talk. So this is a recent extension of what a vulnerable person in terms of mandatory reporting is. So it's a child or a person with a mental disability, or interestingly, they only use female. I don't agree with that because I believe males are also vulnerable to this. Female under the age of 25 who receives tuition at a higher education college or university as defined in Section 1 of the Act, and receives vocational training at a training institute other than the institutes referred to, or it's part of their employment or their residence. So you can see what they've done is they've encapsulated the fact that there are inherent power imbalances that exist within certain structures, and they have recognized that those vulnerabilities are open to potential exploitation. So what do we do about all of this? So professional protects all. So in other words, if you are professional, you protect yourself, you protect everybody around you, you protect your patients with good practice, you protect the profession, you protect the institution, you protect everybody. And if we keep within those bounds and we keep within those roles, we are unlikely to stray. Okay. So what are the challenges to that way of being in the world? Well, first of all, is the medical profession is built on a hierarchy, much like a military establishment or a big corporate or whatever. There's this hierarchy of people, and as you go up the hierarchy, there are different things that happen. And going up that hierarchy, the higher you get up the hierarchy, the less access there is. So as you all know, it's a funnel. You get poured in at the top in first year, but some people come out at the end. Some people go on to specialize. Other people go on to super specialize, become academics, professors, etc. But all along the way, the funnel narrows, and the environment becomes inherently competitive because you are vying for limited spaces to very prestigious things. Okay. In addition to that, there is a huge burden of the life and death nature of the work and the ability to be able to think under enormous amounts of pressure about very complicated decisions that could alter people's lives entirely within massive resource constraints. And that I don't think only exists within the the state sector. I mean, I have seen it within the private sector as well. There's just not enough stuff for what we need to do. So, for example, in the world of mental health that I occupy, we don't know what to do with some of the young people that are being sent to us, because there's nothing. We don't know where to send them, because we don't know what to do, and it creates a huge problem, particularly if you're at the top of the pile where people are coming to look for answers. Then there's the obvious at the moment, which I'm sure you all know about. There's the workload and the burnout. And the workload, I think, for most of us, and I mean certainly for me, is at the moment, it's almost unmanageable. And the wanting to help people and the meaning we get from the jobs we do, and the danger that we become useless because we kind of burn the candle at both ends, and eventually there's no wax left, the wicks meet in the middle, and we fall apart. And ironically, we will sit with people, and in fact, I sit with doctors, who bring their children to me, and they say, no, I tell my patients to do this and this and this and this, but I can't implement it in my own house. But it's even simple things like health, manage your stress, eat properly, make sure you have a work-life balance, etc. But we don't do any of the above. And the thing I've really struggled with, and that I'm probably finding the biggest struggle with, is kind of the moral injuries that are occurring at the moment. This we want to do certain things, we want to do certain interventions, and we see the damage that is being caused by the fact that we actually can't, based on all of the above. And obviously, there's the trauma that comes with it, because we're exposed often to huge amounts of trauma, notwithstanding the fact that we have our own trauma as well. And unfortunately, we sit still within this kind of paternalistic, masculine expected response of, no, we're fine. There's nothing wrong with us. Everything is good, because, if we show any level of kind of vulnerability, it may jeopardize how people see us. It may jeopardize chances of promotion, because we're seen as if we're not coping. And there's a great difficulty around that kind of paternalistic, masculine kind of expected response that I'm okay. And then, in fairness to everybody, there is no real leadership training or communication training, what we call the art of medicine. In other words, sort of your bedside manner, your people skills, and versus the science, which you all know. So change is very hard. And the reason change is hard is that it contains a level of loss. So in the work I do, I work a lot in the sort of child abuse world. So it's a lot about sort of physical abuse and sexual abuse, mental health, massive mental health and behavioral issues in children, and so on. And one of the interesting things we're dealing with at the moment is the fact that corporal punishment has been made indefensible. There's a bit of a gap in the law at the moment around it, but it was a common law crime. There was a defense which was called reasonable chastisement, which people said was based on the Torah and the Bible, and to some extent the Quran, or any of those monotheistic traditions, where spare the rod and spoil the child. Now, that then got translated into give children a hiding and they'll be fine. And if you don't give them a hiding, well, then they're not going to be fine. Now, most of us who grew up in kind of the 70s, 80s, 90s, or earlier, corporal punishment was part of our education system. And most of us, if you say, like, who believes that children should be given hidings? Yeah, get mixed responses. Who have ever given your children a hiding? Mixed responses. Who has ever who has ever been given or been caned at school, or given jacks or cuts or lashes, or whatever they called them in those days? And then you say to them, yeah, but are you okay? And they'll say, yeah, no, I turned out okay. And I'll say to them, are you sure? And it's a very interesting thing, because it's kind of there's this kind of acquiescence and acceptance of these things where we're not really sure why they were helpful, but there's no alternatives. And I think that's the real problem. Is it's looking back and saying, these things that I went through, these have created me, they have made me. Now, if those things are now made to be abusive or traumatizing, etc. I have to kind of reevaluate my whole life and the people who raised me and educated me, etc. And that loss and grief is an incredibly complex thing to deal with, because it's kind of, I went through this to get there, and look at me, I'm okay. And I'm saying, really, we need to remember that things change. I mean, at one stage in the world, slavery was not only legal but was promoted. At one stage, apartheid was the way the world worked. At one stage, you beat children at school. Things change, but I recognize it's hard, and that, going back and looking at your own life and those who taught you and raised you and saying what they did was harmful is an extremely complex thing to do. So how do we manage all of this? Well, first of all, structure is really important. So there's a saying in law. In fact, I was in a lecture at the UJ Department of Law, where the judge gave us a lecture on what she calls being a word surgeon. In other words, how to write reports so that the court can be convinced by your report plus your presentation of that report to the court. And she says paper is cold, but what it does is it creates a set of boundaries in which people know what to expect. So in other words, if you're a lecturer, or if you are a senior member in a trauma team, or if you are a nurse, you know exactly what is expected of the people who head up that particular, say, trauma unit. You know what's expected of you, and it creates a framework within which to think, and it gives a language within which to think. The thing is that must be clearly communicated, and everybody has to know what is communicated about everybody. So in other words, it's a kind of 360-degree thing. We all are on the same page in terms of how our professionalism works, and part of being professional is the kind of person we are. So when those cold paper boundaries start to get blurred, we do what are called carefrontation. So having a courageous conversation and saying, look, help me understand, why you communicate like that. Is there anything we can do to help? And it's really supportive and developmental, rather than being punitive as a starting point. And there has got to be a starting point in a belief in restorative justice, because sometimes we have to unlearn what we have learned, and we don't know what we don't know until we don't know it. And restorative justice is first to restore you to yourself. In other words, this is the kind of person I want to be. Restore you to those you have harmed where possible. Restore you to your community so that there can be harmony. It doesn't mean you like each other, it just means you behave professionally, so that, we can contribute to society, particularly in these very sort of high profile positions. You need a good HR department to do that, who understands that. And the registration bodies need to be able to do things properly and fairly, and have the requisite skills to do the investigations. However, when that is transgressed, we need to hold people accountable, because they represent all of us. And it's a really important thing. People need to be held accountable if they know all of the above and they still choose to flout it. And then obviously, as I've mentioned in the previous slide, when crimes are committed, those need to be reported. So for kind of the last component, we want to report early, and the aim of reporting is to get support for both parties. So we want to recognize what's wrong, because everybody knows what the boundaries are. We want to respond based on the behavior, and we want to respond appropriately. We want to report to get support within the correct structures. We want to record what we do, because it's very important that we have records in these things, and then where necessary, refer for assistance. So what are the opportunities and way forward? I kind of look back at my life. Sort of, I'm in my mid-50s, and I look back at the changes that have happened in my life. And obviously, I'm a white male that emerged from apartheid. I grew up in a working class suburb in Johannesburg, and at some point. At some point, what happened is that, I started getting exposed to other cultures and populations, because in those years you weren't exposed. We were all very isolated. And for me, it was such an incredible revelation, because there was different ways of thinking. There were different cultures. People dressed in different ways. There were these foods, where you'd have these tours of your taste buds, and it was so liberating for me. Then we had this. Then we had kind of the whole kind of attack on masculinity, and obviously now I'm a white male, and then there's the attack on masculinity. And for me, the rise of feminism, for example, liberated me as a man, because it allowed me to live a life where I'm not confined to the stereotypes of masculinity, and I was allowed to express myself in more authentic ways along a role continuum, as opposed to being role bound. So I'm not for 1 second suggesting that we remove the traditional approaches of doing medicine and teaching medicine. However, what I am doing, and I'm doing this in schools and private boys' schools and Milner boys' schools and some girls' schools, is I say, okay, I agree, tradition is important and rites of passage are important, and I believe in the hero's journey and going from worm to chrysalis to cocoon to butterfly. I believe it. However, ask yourself 3 questions. Do I want to keep this? Is this something I want to do? Is it arbitrary? And if it's arbitrary, why do I do it? And is this in violation of ethics, registration, and law? In other words, this must not be kept. And the litmus test for me is, can I not only tell everyone about this practice, but be proud of it and how it reflects the nobility of the profession? And remember, first, do no harm. Thank you.
Thank you. I can't unvideo myself. Host, you have. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Lamprecht. Can I just call you Luke to make it easier?
Please do. Yes, no, absolutely.
Awesome. I see no questions in the Q&A at this current juncture, so I'd like to invite you to add some of your questions there. We only have 14 minutes for conversation, and so if you don't get your question in there, I will get to only ask mine. If you would be so kind as to just throw in some of your thoughts there, maybe they're not questions, but they are comments, it would be really great. So one of my first questions, Doc, is you said that traditions don't have to be traumatic. Now, unfortunately for us, in the medical profession, or at least let me speak for myself, in the medical profession that I was raised in, the tradition and the traumaticness come lumped together. So my question is, how do we separate them? How do they become not interlinked? And you mentioned even in your last slide that we don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. But in what way do we extricate them? Because as you correctly say, I mean, in my mind, most medical schools and boys' schools, and if I think about internship and registrarship, all of the things that you defined as harassment, I'm like, this is just what medical school is. Intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating, offensive. I mean, what is medical school other than this? So how do we start to separate these things out? Please help us.
My first thought around that is the fact that you need to ask why you are doing it. So there's this idea, obviously, which is based on militaristic leadership style, that you need to kind of break everybody down to the base so that you can build up a coherent unit. So I think corporates do it as well. I don't think it's unique to the military. So you become kind of a cog in a wheel, and your own personal identity, the way you are in the world, your questioning of things, and kind of how you present and show up in the world, etc., are not relevant to the job you do. So you simply become an instrument which fits into a system, and that system needs to work in a particular way. And as a result, there's this whole kind of break them down to build them up scenario. Now, what I think is that actually it actually limits what we do, because diversity and people's new ideas and people's personality, etc. All of those things I believe can contribute positively to development, and particularly young people, because young people are really the emotional spark of how things change. So there should be places in which that is embraced, because I do not believe that trauma bonding is the correct way to create a coherent team. If you're wanting, for example, you think of old watches with cogs in them for that clock to tick properly, because what you're doing is you're just putting a cog in a wheel. Whereas if we sort of embrace people, as opposed to as instruments, I think we can start breaking it. We can start breaking that down, because you can achieve the same results by getting people to buy into a system rather than imposing a system. Provided you do it in the correct way, which is really that kind of warrior servitude leadership. I lead from the front because I'm the leader and the warrior, but at the same time, I recognize that this is service. And if we want to be kind and caring and helpful and healing, etc., why are we imposing on one another a harmful system? Okay, so it's about thinking about what purpose is served by that practice, and thinking whether it is the best thing, that it is the best fit for purpose. And the big thing that, I'll go back to my example of corporal punishment with parents, is that parents will say to me, yeah, but this is how I was raised and I turned out okay. And oh, by the way, you've taken away the stick from me. I'm not allowed to hit my children, but you haven't told me what I must do. So in fairness, there needs to be a level at which there are alternative scripts given, because those don't just appear out of thin air. There are things that need to be trained, much like anything else is trained.
Awesome. I mean, I'll come back, probably will end somewhere close to this conversation of alternative scripts. But there are questions in the Q&A, two sets of them that I think are sides of a dice, I suppose. So the one question is about, if a person feels that they are being bullied, what suggestions do you have for them? So it's me now as a person.
Sure.
What suggestions do you have for me? What can I do? That's one side. The other side is, if I work with colleagues of mine and I watch the way they treat their patients or their staff or their students, but this person is now my colleague, how do I show them and help them correct their behavior? If you can just give us a view shortly, we don't have lots of time anymore.
Sure.
Just
okay. Well, fortunately, my answers are relatively short. So the first thing is, what we need to do is we need to stop using labels and use descriptions. So if you feel that something is causing you harm, you start with the phrase I, because that's how you are experiencing what is happening, as opposed to what you think the intention of the person is, because we all have different levels of sensitivity. For example, I have an enormously thick skin. I really don't care what people think about me, because I don't think they think about me at all. So I lead my authentic life because that's the life I want to lead, and what you think of me is not relevant to me. But how I treat people is relevant to me, because that's how I show myself up in the world. But then with that you describe the behavior. Because what has happened in the modern world is the definitions have become on such a large continuum, we don't know what we're dealing with. So it's about not labeling, say, this is how I experienced what you did, and then describe what was done. And then when that is, then remember what I said is that we want to be able to not call people out or whistle blow on people. We want to explain to people the impact their behavior is having on us.
Mm.
And sometimes that may not be reasonable. In other words, their behavior may not be reasonable. And sometimes we may not be reasonable because what's happening is the lens that we are looking at things through is a lens that comes maybe from our past, and that person has no idea that that is something for you. So that would be the description. The challenge is who do you tell? So that sort
Correct.
of goes
That's
to the
what I was
second
going to ask
component,
you.
which 100%. So that goes to the second component. So that goes to if you're witnessing it or it has happened to you, who do you tell? So, for me, there is always, so in my work, we call them safeguarding committees. Okay. So, so we have a safeguarding person, and that person, say, for example, at a school is the person who gets the stuff across their desk. They have various perspectives, for example, medical, occupational, therapeutic, social, whatever it may be. And we say, right, how best do we manage this behavior? And we're hoping to have a conversation up front about the fact that I may not have intended to harm you by what I said or did. It may not have been my intention at all. And if you tell me that it caused me harm, I should be able to correct that behavior and say, you know what, I didn't know. Equally, if it is not reasonable, you need to say, hang on a second, how can we help you? Because when you go out into the world and you're confronted by the reality of the world, you can't disintegrate every time there's a challenge. You have to build up a level at which you can manage that, or you can regulate in terms of how you're confronted by these very traumatic things. So, and that holds equally for people who see their colleagues being called out. So we have people who have a look at the described behavior, and then says, like, we'll have an example that this teacher's grooming me, or that boy's being misogynistic, or whatever. Now, those things need to be looked at in a collective, and to say, all right, how do we do this? And the only way you can do that is if the behavior is described as opposed to labeled.
I got
And
you.
the impact it has on you, and the ability for that person to respond with regards to their intention and the ability to restore.
Right. Okay. I get that. And I imagine in the way that you described things about rites of passage and hero's journey, that there may be examples that we can learn from of how rites of passage is done well, so that we don't only have examples of rites of passages done poorly. Have you seen any such examples in an academic setting, in an academic
Any
setting?
setting. So let me give you an interesting example. So I have a lot of Xhosa boys with me because the Eastern Cape is the home of boxing. So they will come to me and they will have to go to the mountain, to have the rite of passage into manhood. And some of them come back from that experience completely enthralled. They've learned about their culture, their heritage. It's created a level of identity for them. They've done some difficult physical things, etc. But they come back bragging about what they needed to do to enter the hallowed halls of being an adult Xhosa man. And then I have people coming home whose penises have been cut off in the initiation rites. So the important element for me, the big thing, is that it is an enormous honor and an enormous responsibility to be a medical professional. Okay, and it is hard work, and the rewards that you receive and the respect in which you are held are well deserved. But in order to get there, there should never be something you cannot tell someone about that allowed you to get there. You should be able to brag about what you did in order to become who you are.
I hear you. And I mean, I don't know, maybe this is part of what keeps this is that the things we are bragging about is having to endure. We endured the system. That is the bragging right. Whereas I suppose bragging about one's achievement, I did well in this, is not what we get to brag about. Unfortunately, we're out of time, people. I don't know what to do other than maybe ask Sama to allow us to have this conversation again, perhaps the second time around, because we now have language that we can use. We've got language that helps us understand what harassment is. We've got language about tradition versus trauma. We've got language about rites of passage. That helps us. We've got language about behaviors versus labels. We've got language about the need to unlearn. What things do we need to unlearn? We even have language about the kinds of challenges of hierarchy, burnout, resource constraints, leadership training. We've got language about a number of things. So perhaps the next time we have this conversation, we can have it now having some language that we can work with that help us to talk about what is the line between discrimination and bullying? What's the line between hierarchy and correction? Unfortunately, today, we can only brag about the fact that we've given you language to use for you to be able to have conversations. We've equally been given some suggestions of at least some things that we can have. We also have been given language about matters of safeguarding committees that perhaps some institutions can start having so that they can be a place where someone can have a voice if they feel like they're struggling with something. I do hope that at the minimum, all of these pieces of language have helped you. And really thank you, Dr. Luke, for giving us frameworks that we can work with, ways that we can start having this conversation. We're obviously going to have to peel this onion in layers. I'm sorry to everyone whose questions we didn't have the opportunity to answer directly. We'll keep them for the next webinar that we're going to have on this, where we discuss this in detail. If you can fill out the survey at the end of this, it would be great. And if you can send any further questions that you may have, just post them on the chat before you leave so that we can collect the questions in the Q&A and then have a further conversation. I hope, Dr. Luke, you won't mind coming again for us
not at all.
actually just have a conversation now that you've laid the groundwork so very much.
So thank you very much for the invite. You've pushed me into a world that I don't actually inhabit. I hope it was useful. And my concluding quote is, remember, in life, you must never board a ship without an onion. Have a good evening, and we will speak to you another time.
Thank you very much, Luke. Thank you, everybody, for sparing your hour to at least begin having this conversation. Please do not leave without adding your comments, even if you make them anonymous in the Q&A, just so that we can grab some of the themes that you're particularly interested in unpacking, and then we can have a series of conversations. Otherwise, if that is it for you, please have a good evening, enjoy your supper, and stay warm. Bye.